So we're going to be going over different parts of a class. We've just looked at, in previous videos, variables. We saw types. We've seen methods and fields and how to create an object. But now we're going to be looking at a few more specifics. We're going to be looking at a constructor. So a constructor is something that helps you initialize some values. And then we're going to be looking at a couple of keywords that help us create specific methods. I'm going to go over to IntelliJ. I'll open it up. And I have my example here of two planes. These planes are right now able to do a couple of things. They can fly, they can greet passengers, and they can set a name for themselves. Now, we saw how we can use set name to be able to give this variable a value through something called the parameter, which is really a variable as well. What we're going to do now, though, is that when we create a new plane, right now you notice that these parentheses are empty, and we're not giving it any values in which it can begin with, initialize. So instead of using set name to set the plane name, we can do that right at the beginning and just say, I want to create a plane and I want it to have this name right away. So one thing that we can do for that is we can create a constructor. Now, a constructor, as its name, is something that helps you when the object is initially constructed. So we've got our designers who created this blueprint. We've got our engineers who are going to put it together and create the physical plane. And when the plane first starts, it needs to have a few default values. Now, we saw last time that if we set the values up at the top initially, then all of the planes have the same values, and that's not quite what we want. We want each plane to have its own values, so we're going to have to create a constructor. To create a constructor, we start with the word public, and then we use the same name or the same keyword as the class name, and then parentheses and brackets. Now, what does this public word mean? We're going to look at the public word in a second. But first, we're going to go over how a constructor works. Constructor works similar to a setter method in that it takes some variables. So you create some variables. And in this case, I'm going to create a few variables. I'm going to go with 3 variables. And each one of those variables are going to be called input serial, input maker, input name, which is what's going to come from the user or the engineers when they finally create this. And I'm going to use this variable coming in to set the name to the value of that variable. Then I'm going to set the serial number, which is this, to the value of the input serial coming in. And then finally, I'm going to set the maker variable, which is this one, to the value of input maker coming in. How would this work though? How would this help us? When we create a plane, we can then just give it 3 values, and those 3 values have to be in a specific order: name, serial number, and input maker. So I'm going to take this name away from set name, and I will set that string there. And you'll notice that it realizes that I'm putting in the input name variable value, which is this one. And then the next value is going to be the input serial. So I'm going to give it some serial number, which is an integer. And then finally, I have one more variable that I had to give a value to, and that's maker. In this case, we're going to go with Airbus. Let's go with Boeing instead. Now, when I use this, these values are going to be passed into these fields. And you're going to remember that greet passengers uses the name field to print out the name. So the value that I give it through the constructor is the value that's going to be set for name. And then when I call greet passengers, that name should be printed out. So if I call greet passengers on this plane that I created, and this plane has input name Big Boeing plane, greet passengers should print out, hi, my name is Big Boeing plane. If I change this here, I can change the name to begin with at any time. So let's go with just my name. And let's say, hi, my name is Ed. It gives it that value. But let's say that we want to change the name of the plane later on. I can still use set name and change it to a different name, and then I can call greet passengers again, and it's going to show the new name. So first, it uses the initial value that you gave it to the constructor, then you change the value, and then it uses that value afterwards. If I uncomment this second plane, I'm going to have an error here. And I have an error because it's expecting 3 things, but I didn't give it any. So if I wanted to, I could create 2 different constructors, public, one constructor with nothing, and then one constructor with different inputs. If I use a constructor with nothing, then my values are going to be empty to begin with. If I use a constructor with inputs, then I will just be taking in inputs and setting those. But usually when you have a constructor with nothing in it, you set some default values there. So I'm going to set some default values for any plane that's created with an empty constructor or a no argument constructor. So I'll go with name, default name, and then model, generic model. Serial number is 131313, and then maker is going to be generic maker. So I'm just giving it these default values, and if I did this, any plane that's created with the default values will then use those no matter what. So I'm going to create a third plane here. I'm going to go with plane 3, new airplane, constructor without any values. So that means it's going to use this constructor without any values. So when this airplane is created, these fields are going to have these values, and then I'm going to check those values. So I'm going to say plane 3, greet passengers. Now, what should I expect here? I should expect plane 1 to greet passengers with the name that I gave it, and then I should expect plane 2 to use the default name, and then I should expect plane 3 to also use the default name. And that's what ended up happening. So what could I do? Well, maybe I want to set name later on, and I know exactly what I want to call it. In this case, I would set the name first, and then I would greet the passengers. Even though I use a no argument constructor, I still set the name, so it should still work when I greet the passengers. But in this one I didn't, so I'm just going to have to use that default name, and that's what happened. So with the constructor, let's say that you wanted to create this plane, but this plane is going to have a name to begin with, and we're going to call it Ed. Can you only use one? You could if you created a constructor that way. So you could continue to create constructors that only have, say, public airplane. And in this case, I'm only going to take in one thing. This is going to be input name. And we're going to set name to the input name. So I could take a constructor that only takes one value, which would be the input name. I could take a constructor that takes 3 values. I could take a constructor that creates no values. Could I do a constructor that has only 2 values? Well, in this case, I don't have that constructor, so I can't just give it 2 values. Could I do this? It's going to say, no, you can't do that. I'm expecting some other type of values in the constructor, and you're not giving me what I want. I don't know of any constructor that only uses a string and an int. You have to do something different. So if I ran this, then I would have one constructor using this, one constructor using none, and then one constructor using 3.